Dr. William L. Sparks. Will Sparks serves as in the Dennis Thompson Chair and Professor of Leadership at the McCall School of Business at Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina. Concurrently, he serves as the Managing Director for William L. Sparks & Associate, a leader, team, and organization development professional services firm. He is the author of Actualized Leadership, Meeting Your Shadow and Maximizing Your Potential, 2019 Society for Human Resources Publishing, which debuted as an Amazon #1 bestseller. His TED Talk, The Power of Self-Awareness, was released in 2018. He holds a PhD in organizational psychology from the George Washington University School of Business and Public Management. He resides in Charlotte, North Carolina with his wife, Erin, and their Cavapoo, Shelby, and I think you also need to add in here a dad.
To be. Yes.
So, with no further ado, Dr. Will Sparks.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. All right, good afternoon. I am excited to be with you this afternoon and looking forward to our time today. We have about 90 minutes to talk about leadership and a model and framework I've been working on for a number of years. Really focused as a little bit of a reaction to a Strength Finders only focus. My work has been heavily influenced by a number of folks I'll talk about in a little bit, but the sort of the basic idea is that if you want to step into your brightest light, if you really want to realize your highest potential, you have to have the courage to look back and be aware of the darkness. And that's a little bit counter to what we've been taught in the last decade, where there's been such an emphasis on strength finders and such an emphasis on playing to your strengths and validating your strengths, and I'm all for that. But over and over again, what I see are individuals who fail to live up to their highest potential or who get derailed because they fail to acknowledge the darkness. And so my work is intended to help individuals understand that and to begin the process to reconcile that. So it's not as heavy as it sounds. I promise it'll be fun. I'll try to be entertaining and fun. I also realize that I'm between you and unstructured free time this afternoon starting at 2 o'clock. And being between a group this size and the bar is not a great place to be. So I'm very aware of the time and what's on the agenda for the rest of the day. So you have my word that we will have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. Because this is a phenomenal facility, and I've really enjoyed being here the last couple of days. And I guess it turned out that I was more of a Jimmy Buffett fan than I realized, because I've remembered so many of these great songs that are playing. It's sort of hard to focus on organizational psychology and leadership development when in the back of my mind I'm wanting a cheeseburger and a margarita. So I'm trying to stay focused here. The subtitle of my book is really intended to sort of create this a little bit of a not tension in the reader, but a little bit of like, okay, so you got to meet your shadow to maximize your potential. There's a little bit of a sort of divergence there, and I did that on purpose in the title to sort of set this up as a premise. Just a little bit about me. I've been a professor of leadership and business management for the last 22 years at Queen's University. I taught at GW, George Washington, for 2 years. This accent that you hear is real, and it's from the Carolinas, and so I was looking forward to getting back home, and so I've been in Charlotte ever since, and have been professor there. I've also done a fair amount of leadership development, executive coaching, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the folks that have influenced this work as well, some names that you may know. One of them is Steve Clifford, who, for those of you that are here, who of all of you live here in Orlando or fans of the Magic? Okay, so Steve Clifford left Charlotte Hornets, came to Orlando, and is coming back to the Hornets this year. So we're excited about his return. And so in addition to the research that I've done, which no one really wants to hear about that, and I completely understand that. It's more about the applied piece and making meaning of this, and that's what I want to dive into. So I'd like to share a little bit about some of the organizations that I've worked with over the years that have implemented this assessment And this work gelled when Ally Financial, technically it's still headquartered in Detroit. It's the former GMAC. So many of you may be as old as I am and remember all of our Chevrolet Impala station wagons growing up in the 70s were all financed with GMAC. Charlotte Airport in the city of Charlotte, Duke Energy, had the great privilege of going out to SoFi Stadium a couple of months ago and work with their operations, IT, and security teams there. And that is a phenomenal, just an unbelievable arena there. And a number of other clients as well. So talk a little bit about their work. Sort of the only little bit of, not even theory, but just the only sort of theoretical slide I have for our presentation today is a reminder of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How many of you remember this from a Psych 101 class way back? Okay, I see some hands going up. So yeah, you remember essentially Abraham Maslow, a famous psychologist who really started the humanistic movement in many ways. Today we call that applied positive psychology. Maslow was really interested in understanding why we do the things we do. And by the way, speaking of the book, we have copies for you that will be handed out after the session this afternoon. So everyone, we do have copies for everyone there. I'm going to share this presentation with Beth as well and ask her to send that out to anyone who might be interested. So I'll email that to her, or actually she has it. And I invite her to share that with the group as well if you're interested. There may be a few slides with some quotes or the like that you may want to review. Essentially, in a nutshell, Maslow said we're driven by lower needs, and when those needs get met, they stop influencing our behavior. And so higher order needs emerge, and that drives or propels our behavior. And you go from biological or physiological needs, air, water, just sort of food, basic needs, up to safety, and then the sense of belonging, which can be in a romantic relationship, or it can be in a community, a neighborhood community, a faith-based community. And then most of us stop at esteem. And that is when we develop a certain degree of expertise. We're recognized as a technical expert, and so we know our job, we have great technical expertise, we're right, we're smart, we like to be sort of recognized for that, we like to help other people with their problems. And Maslow estimated that about 90% of us sort of stop there. But there's one higher order need that can emerge, and instead of a deficiency need like the bottom four, it's a growth need, and that is the need for self-actualization, the need to actualize or to realize your highest purpose and potential. A famous colonel that was played by, I'm blanking on the actor. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Men Who Stare at Goats with George Clooney. Part of that was based on a true story, and the lieutenant colonel, I'm blanking on the actor's name now, that played this role was heavily influenced by Abraham Maslow in real life, and he came up with the tagline from the 70s and 80s, "Be all you can be," in the U.S. Army. That was a very sort of a humanistic Maslow tagline, and that's essentially what self-actualization is. And my research has been focused on what does that matter for leadership? How does that matter in management? How does that matter when we are delegating tasks or we're working with others or collaborating with others? And it turns out it matters a lot because it moderates the activization of what I call your leadership shadow. It manages that process for when you get triggered and where you go when that happens. And so in my research, I've been able to identify essentially 3 styles that have 3 unique strengths and 3 unique shadows. And I want to explore that and give you a chance to self-assess here in just a moment, so that instead of talking about a theoretical kind of construct, you have something that you can look at on your phone or your tablet that hopefully will have more relevance and more meaning to you. So this is based, the primary theorist that has influenced me is Carl Jung, more so than anyone else. Carl Jung is the famous Swiss psychologist who I think is the most influential psychologist, and maybe even you could argue philosopher in the last couple of hundred years in Western culture. And Carl Jung reminds us in this quote that we don't become enlightened by positive affirmations, by playing to our strengths. This is imagining figures of light. We become enlightened. We can self-actualize our highest potential when we become aware and conscious of our darkness. So Jung really setting up this sort of notion here that we have to become aware of that. It's real and it's present, and we all have it. Denying it or ignoring it feeds it and gives it even more power over us. So a very important quote, I think, there for us to consider. And this work is grounded on self-awareness, true self-awareness. True self-awareness disturbs and disrupts. And again, when I say true self-awareness, I mean not just the shallow end of the strength finder's pool. True self-awareness is going into the deep end of that pool and understanding the limitations, or what I call the shadow piece, what triggers us uniquely and where we go under stress when we are triggered. So that kind of self-awareness disturbs and disrupts. It does not comfort, but it is in this disturbance. In fact, I would argue it is only in this disturbance where we are afforded an opportunity to step into our brightest light. But we have to have the courage to acknowledge and sort of own, if you will, that leadership shadow or that darkness. It's a little bit counterintuitive because many of us have been told to sit up straight, know the answer, be right, and that kind of process. And I'm all for applying yourself and being motivated and being prepared and hard work, very much so. But I think Jung's saying, yeah, but we get it wrong because that works up to a point. Then it starts to hold us back if we won't let our guard down. The most watched TED Talk of all time is Brené Brown's The Power of Vulnerability. How many of you have seen Brené Brown's TED Talk? Just a few. Okay, if you are interested, it's very funny. It's about 12 years old now, but it's got 58 or 59 million views. It's called The Power of Vulnerability. Brené Brown has turned into a rock star. So now she's literally selling out 5,000 and 10,000 seat arenas for her talks. And one of the reasons is because her concept of vulnerability has resonated so much with many of us, because she's saying if you want an authentic life and you want true connection with others, you got to be willing to let your guard down and to be vulnerable for that sort of authentic connection. And I think that's one of the reasons she has become so well known and so famous. So I'd like to take just a moment and talk about my sort of introduction to my shadow, and then give you an opportunity to self-assess, and then we'll have some time for some individual sort of paired discussions, and then toward the end of the 90 minutes, I'll open it up for some audience, any kind of questions or discussion or anything else that may be on your mind. But I'd like to share speaking of vulnerability, I'd like to try to practice that in just a few minutes and share this story that is the topic of my TED Talk, The Power of Self-Awareness, from 2018. And in fact, you may not be able to read that, but that's actually Steve Clifford's quote, and I still have the Orlando Magic, I forgot about that. I've got the Orlando Magic affiliation there. I've had the honor of working for Coach Clifford and the Hornets for the last decade or so. In my TED Talk, I just talked about when I was a new doctoral student at George Washington University in 1996. I was 27 years old, and I was, so excited. I was going up to the big city of Washington, D.C. I just finished my master's at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, in organizational psychology. I was going to be studying under Dr. Jerry Harvey. I don't know if any of you have seen the video, The Abilene Paradox, or read that article. It's a very funny, it was the best-selling training video of all time about a family that decides to go to Abilene, but no, Texas. They go to Abilene, Texas, when no one really wants to go. And it's a very sort of a funny Dr. Seuss quality of helping us understand why we make decisions and do things in groups that we often don't want to do, but yet we end up on the road to Abilene. And so I was studying under Dr. Harvey. I had all of these great things going for me, except one fly in the ointment. There was a pretty big fly in the ointment, and that was I was going through a divorce. My high school sweetheart, Shannon, and I were in the tail end of a divorce. I was the only person in my family to ever gotten divorced. And so Dr. Harvey's Abilene Paradox was based on dependency in relationships. and how our fear and our codependency causes these kinds of bad decisions. So I decided to write about the dependency in my failed marriage. And the last class, we handed in our papers, the class before the last one, and we had our last class meeting. We were sitting in a circle, and Dr. Harvey went around and handed out the final papers and the grades, and very dramatically sighed and said how disappointed he was in one person, and somebody pulled out a B. He never would have guessed it. They had it in him. I mean, he was very candid and very direct in his feedback. And he went all the way around the room, and then he got to me at the very end and looking down at me over the sort of the rim of his glasses, and I'm looking up at Dr. Harvey waiting for my paper, and he said, "William, son, you're going to need to come see me for your grade." Yeah, and the whole class did that. The whole class was like, "Whoa, what?" This wince, and I was like, "Oh, no." And so couldn't concentrate for the rest of the class. Was worried that night. His office hour started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was there at 3:58, ready to go. And I knocked on his door, and Dr. Harvey, the late Dr. Harvey, he passed away in 2015, referred to himself as a Bible-thumping Southern Baptist, and he was reading the Bible when I knocked on his office door. And without even looking up, he just pointed at the chair that was across from his desk. So I walked in and sat down and waited, and literally for him to finish chapter and verse, and he finished, and he turned around and he looked at me, took his glasses off, dramatically rubbed his forehead and sighed and said, "William, son, what are we here to talk about?" And I said, "Well, Dr. Harvey, yesterday you asked me to come and meet you to talk about my paper, so I'm here to talk about my final paper." And he said, "Nope, we're not here to talk about your paper. Son, what are we really here to talk about today?" And that threw me. My paper. I want to know what I made on my grade. And so my 27-year-old, arrogant, pretty full of myself brain started kicking into overdrive, trying to think, well, then what are we here to talk about? And I thought of something quickly, and I said, "Well, Dr. Harvey, perhaps we're here to talk about my experience in the class. You may be interested in my feedback for you in the class." That was the wrong answer. It amused him and it irritated him at the same time, mostly irritated him. And if you read chapter 1 of my book, you'll see in very colorful language, he let me know under no uncertain terms he did not care about my feedback or even my experience in his class. But he said, "Son, I'm going to ask you one more time before I fail you from the class. What are we here to talk about?" And at that point, I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And so I said, "Well, I guess we're here to talk about my divorce." And smiling and winking at me, he said, "I'll give you a B- on that answer because we're actually here to talk about you." And he pointed at me. And he held that point for just a second too long, and I remember thinking, this is going to hurt. And it did. And long story short, I had written the paper about the dysfunction of dependency in my failed marriage from my perspective. And my soon-to-be ex-wife, Shannon, had become more dependent over the years, and I had to make all the decisions, and I was always having to solve the problems, and I wanted an equal partner, and yada. And so we talked about that, and he had read it, and he winced when I said some of those things. I wasn't sure why. I found out later, but it was an unusual conversation because his nonverbals were pretty dramatic. And at the end of it, he said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. And the good news is you made an A on your paper." And I said, "Holy cow," I couldn't believe it. Dr. Harvey had written the textbooks that were in my master's program. So I was studying at the feet of Yoda. I felt like I had gone to the mountain, and I couldn't believe it. And he started giving me compliments about one thing to know something, but you've experienced it, and that tells me one day you can teach it. And he cited Jung and Freud and the Greek philosophers and all of this stuff, and he's setting me up. So I'm pumped up. And I, again, in my 27-year-old arrogant mind, I thought, well, now I know why he. Well,